My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by someone who I read quite a bit of research from and know quite a bit about, but never actually had the pleasure of speaking with. That's Shyam Chavda. How's it going, Shyam?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on. I think you do a great job with these podcasts, and I've listened to a few in the past. So it's nice to be on.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. And I know I've had a few people who are also involved, kind of in your circle on. I think Stu Martin might be one who really sticks out.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we had Anna Swisher on the Weightlifting House podcast, and we've kind of had a bunch of people who you'll see the names referenced in very similar spaces pretty often. So I think it's cool to kind of further explore people who are involved in understanding, studying, and creating new knowledge, or distilling and capturing existing knowledge about our sport, which is what I feel you do. For people who aren't as familiar as I am with your work, maybe you can describe what you currently do, what your work looks like, and your involvement with the sport.
Sure. So I'm a course leader for a master's program for strength and conditioning at Middlesex University. That's my day-to-day job. I'm towards the back end of my PhD, where I'm looking at high-performance weightlifting. So I hope to get that boxed off very soon. I've run the university weightlifting club for nearly 11 or 12 years now, and been very fortunate to coach some very good weightlifters, and I've had the pleasure to coach at the Tokyo Olympics as Cyril Chachit's coach, who now lifts for Team GB. And outside of my academic careers, I'm the lead performance scientist at British Weightlifting. So I essentially look at our strategies in implementing sports science and how we can better support our athletes right the way from our talent transfer all the way to the top podium lifters.
Yeah, and as someone who hears that and is very, very who finds that very, very interesting and like a really cool career choice, and also I find it very impressive you have the ability to occupy those roles. How do you end up getting into what's ultimately led you to this point of being program director, course director, part of the performance team with British Weightlifting, someone who can be involved with weightlifting from the classroom to the Olympic Games?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to luck and opportunity and taking those opportunities. But there's that saying of you create your own luck. So working in academia, we kind of identified there was a bit of a gap in the market, and we developed a distance education strength and conditioning course before COVID had actually hit. So that was my opportunity to have a wider reach out into the world of strength and conditioning and to disseminate information, through our courses. In terms of getting to the Olympics, it's always been like a teenage dream of mine. And Cyril had joined the university as a mental health nurse. I obviously coached him, and I still do coach him. His situation was a very unique one in that he couldn't qualify for any international events, so he was earmarked to be part of the refugee Olympic team. And without going into too much detail, it got to a point where he was selected, and of
Mm.
course we both went out to Tokyo. Um, and then my involvement with British weightlifting is actually it's it comes in many different forms. It started off as a course educator, um, and I still deliver some of the courses. And there was a point where there's a bit of a reshuffle, and they were looking for some regional coaches. I managed to land a regional coaching role.
Mm.
In that regional coaching role, I think they it was it became a little bit obvious that maybe I'd be better suited supporting via sports science, given my background. So that kind of changed a little bit, and I became more of a supporting role within sports science to the performance manager, and that's just grown ever since. And you mentioned Stu Martin earlier. That's essentially my boss, and that's the guy I work very
Mm.
closely with. So it's been a real pleasure to be part of the system and to continue to grow our systems and our outreach within weightlifting at the high level in the UK.
Yeah, and at the start of that, you mentioned it's been a dream of yours to kind of go to the Olympics and to coach at the
Mhm.
Olympics. Where did that dream start? So you kind of described, the path there. When you were growing up, were athletics a big part of your life? Was that something that you were heavily involved with and wanted to also pursue as an athlete, or was it always just from the coaching perspective?
So I, for those that know me, will probably laugh at the next bit. So I actually played basketball, and the reason I say for those that know me will laugh is because I'm actually 5'7". Um, on a good day. So I never excelled
Hmm.
in basketball, but I really enjoyed it. I actually picked up weightlifting really late. So I picked up weightlifting when I was at university as a master's student. So I was in my mid 20s, and I was actually doing MMA at the time,
Hmm.
and we had to learn weightlifting as part of our course because we were going to be assessed on it. I then had the opportunity to take one of the courses that British weightlifting offered back then, and I jumped on that, and then I really enjoyed weightlifting. I enjoyed the coaching part. I then got asked to coach the university team, which was a very, very small team back then. It was maybe like 3 or 4 people. Um, and there were days where I'd be coaching, training, which was quite demanding, and working as well, obviously. Um, and then on competition days, there'd be times where I was officiating,
Hmm.
lifting, and coaching, and I was like, I can't give my best to any of these because I'm so split. So I made the decision of, look, I'm not going to be a good weightlifter, but I can be a good coach, or I can try and be a good coach. So I just took that route, and I felt like with Cyril being one example of the international athletes that I coach, with him there was such a big opportunity that I always wanted to work in elite sport. I never knew what that elite sport would be, but I was, very fortunate to come across weightlifting, even though it was quite late in my lifetime. I asked myself the question of, you have someone here who, he's got a pretty amazing story, but he's also a very, very good weightlifter.
Hmm.
I have to ensure that there's no stone left unturned if we're to get to the Olympics. And that's where all these performance questions started popping up. And because of those questions, it then allowed me to start using some of my academic background to delve a little bit deeper into them, and hence why we have a few publications out there. So that's really where it stemmed from.
Yeah, and the academic side of it sounds like there was this intersection of kind of all of it all at once. But then it's kind of developed into, I think like pretty extensive branches of, coaching extensively and at a high level, and being heavily involved with that. And then
Mhm.
being an academic, and teaching, and researching. And then you mentioned working on your PhD. I actually didn't know you were in the process of that. So that must be really, really cool as well. Um, you detailed more of the coaching side, then the academic side, some of the papers that you guys have published. Um, would you mind kind of going into, I guess, like the history of that, in the sense of what was like the timeline of, maybe your first publication, or your first publication related to weightlifting? Because we wanted to record this episode and discuss a recent paper on weightlifting for sport performance.
Mhm.
As someone who's curious to understand it, sometimes in S&C you'll hear, oh, well, we're not training powerlifters, or we're not training weightlifters.
Yeah.
What does that really mean? Because the athletes are still going to squat, they're still going to do, pulls or deadlifts, variations of. They're still going to bench or press,
Sure.
snatch, clean, jerk, push press. So like all these exercises that are the crux of the sport, or supportive of the sport, aren't athletic performance. But here's this paper that says weightlifting for sport performance. So I'd love to dive into that once we kind of cover some ground on how you started, becoming a scientist and developed up to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to go into that. So I suppose so. I'm an early career researcher. Um, I also term myself not so much, although I use the term academic, maybe not so much an academic, but just a very, very curious coach, because I like to ensure that what I'm studying or researching can have an impact on the athletes
Mm.
that I'm working with, or at least on a population of individuals, which at the moment is in the sport of weightlifting. So one of my first papers is is actually a paper that tells you how to develop a script in Microsoft Excel
Hmm.
to analyze the counter movement jump. And that might seem really detached from what we're talking about now, but actually, that that paper was it was my first author publication. But the reason that came about is because I knew I wanted to do something in weightlifting, and my my mentor and very good friend of mine, Professor Anthony Turner, was like, "Look, the jump is relatively simple to try and understand, especially the force time characteristics. So if you can get your head around that, you'll start to understand other movements a lot better."
Mm.
So that's where that came from, and he was right. It definitely helped me understand the interaction between force and time, and how we manipulate our body, and just general biomechanics. I think once you have a fundamental understanding of biomechanics, weightlifting becomes a lot easier to not just understand, but to also ask yourself, well, if I change the position of the athlete here, then what's the consequence? Or if I want them to generate more force in that second pull, what coaching
Mm.
cue could I use to influence um, pushing for longer or being faster? So it just helped me in quite a few different ways. If we skip forward, I think there was then the paper on um, coaching weightlifting, where we presented stable and variable
Mm.
components. Um, and that was an extension of some of the work that's been done in British weightlifting by the former head of coaching, Giles Greenwood, a very well known coach. Sean Joff as well came up with some of those principles. So that's something we use within British weightlifting. But what I feel like we didn't have is the scientific underpinning of it. So that was essentially that paper. Like, why do we say the bar should be over the midfoot as a stable component? From a biomechanical perspective,
Mm.
why do we need to try and to try and hit that marker? Why is um, the way you start either dynamic or static? Why is that a variable component? What are some of the caveats to each method? And that's what we discussed there. So that was more so making weightlifting more accessible to be able to coach, not just for weightlifting coaches, but also for those that may use weightlifting within team sport athletes or other individual athletes that aren't weightlifters. And essentially, it becomes about optimal versus effective. In weightlifting, we're trying to optimize, uh, but maybe in team sports, we just want that lift to be effective in eliciting whatever the outcome is that we're chasing.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
Yeah, and I, like thinking through and kind of looking over all of the papers, particularly from your ResearchGate, I find them all very interesting. And I think the paper where you described and then created a more kind of reinforced explanation of weightlifting technique and the different aspects of it. I know that was really when I came across that, I was like blown away. And I think a lot of it, I know I've had these conversations before where you get taught something in weightlifting and it's like, yeah, this is just kind of the right way to do it. And I don't think this is unique to weightlifting, but it's just the example. But it's like, yeah, this is the way to do it. And it's like, well, why is it the way to do it? And then you're trying to peel back the layers of understanding. And I think what you guys captured really well was the rationale for, as you mentioned, start the bar in this position, pull in this way, execute the lift, in a very particular manner so that you can optimize these aspects of, the way the movement has to occur given kind of the pulling forces of gravity or the way the body's like oriented. So I thought it was a great paper. I was like really excited about that. I made a handful of graphics like built off of it. And then kind of transitioning a little bit more and for everyone who's listening and they're interested, I'll definitely link all this stuff down below so you can pull the papers and check them out.
Oh, we'd appreciate that.
Yeah. And then as far as, and you mentioned kind of understanding the jump, which if you look at, or when I look at papers that discuss strength and conditioning or different methods of strength training for sport performance, they talk about the influence on a vertical jump or the influence on different types of jumps. Maybe you could do a little bit of a deeper dive on, you talked about the force time characteristics of a jump, kind of further understanding that to understand weightlifting a bit better. But I think that would help us understand that would help us understand athletics a lot better. So maybe you can kind of go into your understanding of the role or relevance of different types of jumps and the like all of the stuff underneath that would be relevant to weightlifting and sport coaches.
Yeah, certainly. I'll give it a good go. So if you look at some of the original literature presented by, I'm going to butcher his name. I'll try not to. Medvedev from the Soviet Union, a systems of multi-year training in weightlifting, I believe. There's a couple of figures in there which show weightlifters, track athletes, and like just sedentary individuals at different age groups. And what it shows is the weightlifter outperforms the track athlete when it comes to things like, well, there are only a few measures, but it was jumping performance and hand grip strength and another lower body measure. So if you think about what that's actually telling us in terms of the use of weightlifting generally, it highlights the physical prowess that weightlifters actually have, likely as a consequence of their training, right? So that already begins to open up the door of, well, why not implement some of these exercises, because essentially they are exercises, in current athletic training to elicit some change. So when you look at weightlifting videos, you can see they're doing these amazing box jumps, and they can jump really, really high. So their ability to express force, especially relative to their body mass, is incredible. And the reason being is because they lift very, very heavy weights in, let's call them, uh, dynamic strength exercises. So, squats and pulls, well in excess of their body weight. They're also doing heavy ballistic work. So let's say clean and jerk. They're doing slightly lighter but still heavy ballistic work with the likes of the snatch. So velocity is going to be faster. And then you've got all your technical work, which tends to be majority of the time spent in that 70 to 80% range, where the intention of moving quickly and to refine elements of technique is going to be a fundamental component. So they're doing slightly more higher velocity work. So that's why they can jump so well. But when you look at the force time characteristics of a snatch or a clean, there's a real big similarity between that and the jump, particularly in the propulsive elements. So when we look at the literature that has compared weightlifting performance to surrogate measures of weightlifting performance, such as jump height, standing broad jump, there's always this really good relationship, right, with things like peak power and jump height in particular. Now, there is a slight issue with that, and we've just had a paper published in the Journal of Science and Sport and Exercise on this. Jump height will be affected by changes in body mass. So we need to ensure that if we're using jump height as a proxy measure, we need to understand that has their body mass changed? Because if their body mass has gone down, then of course they're going to be able to jump higher without having any real change in force expression. So in our new paper, we looked at the relationship between weightlifting performance and more underlying mechanisms that are underpinning factors of jump performance. So we looked at propulsive impulse, time of propulsion, peak power, average power, and so on. And concentric impulse, so the propulsive element of the jump, had the greatest relationship with weightlifting performance in all national level weightlifters. That was for men and women. It also had the lowest variability, meaning it's extremely sensitive to change. So if you're looking at a training intervention, then you're likely to see some sort of change in propulsive impulse. And because it's now more mechanistic, it means we can start to understand how people are applying force, or how certain interventions are affecting the ability to apply force in a proxy measure, which is very easy to obtain without being overly fatiguing, right? I think you spoke about this in one of your podcasts about the 1RM. So it's one of the best measures for weightlifting, of course, but it's super fatiguing. We can't do that all the time. That's why we have proxy measures such as jumping and isometric mid thigh pulls. So that kind of covers why jumping is so well related to weightlifting, but also why weightlifters have such a good ability to jump.
No, that makes complete sense. And then, with respect to using snatches, cleans, jerks, and their variants for sports performance, what, I guess, what was the starting point for you, or what's the point? What was the initial point of your understanding as far as the role of those exercises and their variants and how they influence, more broadly sport performance, and then being a part of that position stand, did that change at all, or has that changed at all? And how do you feel like your perspective has shifted?
Yeah, I think it's always quite an obvious one with the relationship between weightlifting and sport performance, and I think most of the relationship comes from the fact that if we look at the temporal characteristics of, let's say, a clean, especially during the second pull, where the greatest force is produced in the shortest amount of time relative to the first pull, it means we're creating this really high amount of impulse, right,
Mm,
through a high magnitude of force in a relatively short time, which also then means the athlete's creating a really high amount of momentum during that phase to the system being the body weight and the barbell. And the reason this happens is because of the triple extension pattern of the ankle, knee, and the hip, which will be very similar to what you'd view when you see sprinting, change of direction, and jumping in, let's say, field sport athletes. Um, so I think that's why weightlifting has been used to train the athletic population. And then when you also look at the literature, the relationship between weightlifting performance, let's say power clean, for example, and your typical athletic tests such as sprinting and jumping, it tends to show these moderate to high relationships, which again just builds on that rationale
mm,
behind why weightlifting might be so popular as a training tool. Um, and more recently, with Paul Comfort and Tim Sukamel's work looking at the different derivatives with catches and without catches, just adds another layer of for being able for coaches to expand their toolbox,
mm.
right, and use different derivatives at different times in the season. So I think that's where the importance and the relationship between weightlifting and athletic training comes together. Um, don't know if that's answered your question.
No, I think that's great. I wonder, as a weightlifting coach myself, and then as you being a weightlifting coach, if you were to work with athletes, and I spoke with Sean Waxman about this because he
Mhm.
took over the strength and conditioning role for a high school football team in Utah, and he mentioned as a strength and conditioning coach, also as a weightlifting coach, you have to develop this criteria of saying this is not as good as we need to be, but this is good enough. And that sounds kind of derogatory, but it's the idea that you're parsing out the technique for weightlifting, which is
Mhm.
incredibly, focused and detailed, and you're
Yeah,
hyper
for
vigilant to
sure.
make sure certain aspects of it are perfect or as perfect as possible. And then for strength and conditioning, you're looking at training effects. And I've had this conversation with athletes of, hey, the technique matters because when we're using very, very light weights, we're not training the qualities that we want to train. So we need load to be able to train the qualities and train them effectively and to continue to train them. To add load and train them correctly, we'd like to use a repeatable movement that's efficient and correct. So how do we develop that over time? So you're not really facing, an issue of, I need to program the weightlifting movements correctly. You're kind of looking at the broader issue of, I need to teach them correctly enough, train them correctly enough, and then use them as proxies in and of themselves to sport performance. To say if your clean's gone up, I assume you're a better athlete, and you probably express qualities that would show me that you have the potential to be a better athlete. I don't know how game performance
Mhm.
is actually influenced or changed because there's the whole tactical side, and there's just chance, of what could or couldn't happen. as a weightlifting coach, talking about using those movements for sport performance, what's your perspective on, I guess, like the ecological side of it, like putting them into action, using them effectively, making sure they're part of a program and done in a way that's supportive of performance and provides the opportunity for expressing, you know, the enhanced athletic qualities.
Yeah, it's it's that age-old argument which seems to go on Twitter for forever. It just never seems to die off. But it's a tool
Mm,
that people can use, right? I don't think you need to sit on either side of the fence on these polarized views.
mm,
Really, we have to remember why we're using what we're using. If we go back to real foundational S&C, specific adaptation to imposed demand, right? So if we take the weightlifter, for example, we we want to ensure they've got the necessary physical qualities to snatch and clean and jerk the most weight possible. They do a lot of snatch, they do a lot of clean and jerk, so they have to use lots of derivatives at different loads to improve certain elements, whether that be the timing, whether that be
mm,
increase in force production or stability, could be any of those things. But the point is to get them to snatch and clean and jerk more weight. So however we decide to implement that in their program should always map back to the key performance indicator of snatch and clean and jerk as much as you can.
mm,
In team sports or outside of weightlifting, the so the goalposts change a little bit in that your goal isn't to get them to snatch and clean and jerk as much weight as possible. It's to make sure they're available to play games, make sure
mm,
that they're healthy, and make sure that any well-related proxy of their sport is improving as some measure of athletic performance, so speed, jump height, something along those lines, for example. So if it goes back to what I kind of mentioned earlier, there's optimal and then there's effective.
mm,
We'd love everybody to be fully optimal, right? But as we know, that takes many, many years. And if someone, even a weightlifter, if they were that good and that optimal, then there's no need for a coach. They'll just carry on doing what they're doing and they'll just get better. But they'll probably show an error
mm,
when the weight gets 1 or 2 kilos heavier or at a certain percentage, and then we need to sort that out. Whereas if you've got a bunch of high school athletes in the gym and there's like 20 of them, you're not going to get an opportunity to be so detailed. But what you can do is get them to lift in a way which is effective to elicit an adaptation that you're after.
mm,
So let's just take an example of a you're in a competition phase of the season. You've not got a lot of time or contact time with them in the gym. You have to be cognizant that, I say, it's a contact sport. Their shoulders are getting hit a lot. They're getting a lot of leg contacts. So you don't want them to be doing too much work in the gym, but at the same time, you appreciate that you need to at least maintain their their ability to express force at the highest possible rate. So maybe you would choose power variants or partial pulls, for example, where they might lift from the block and then drop it, as opposed to lifting all the way from the floor,
mm,
where they're going to be performing more work, which would be more fatiguing. So I think that's probably the difference between coaching in weightlifting and coaching outside of weightlifting is what you're trying to chase. It's the adaptations you're trying to chase either way. The KPIs are obviously different because it's different sports, and weightlifting is the KPI is very simple. But it's a closed skill sport, So we need to optimize within weightlifting. Outside of weightlifting, as much as we'd love them to be lifting as optimally as possible, effective is also good enough to elicit
Mm.
adaptation.
And I wonder too how much of that. And so I know in sports science, I've read papers where they reference the black box and putting some sort of training stimulus in, having it processed, and then getting a result, and using athlete monitoring and different forms of assessment to get a feel for what's happening in that black box. So during a certain amount of training, you're applying a stress. You're trying to measure and monitor exactly what's happening, the amount of fatigue the athlete's under, performance potential, the changes that are occurring. That way, you're not just kind of putting something in at the end saying, "Well, that wasn't what we wanted." Things kind of went really haywire and the wheels fell off. So we're essentially dealing with somewhat of a black box. I think for athletics, it could feel even more like a black box depending on which sport it is. And I'm just kind of thinking about, say maybe wrestling, where people are going to be in really odd positions in a
Yeah.
lot of different positions, having to produce force in a lot of different ranges of motion at different joints. And you would say, well, the snatch is an exercise that could be really beneficial for, you know, hip extension, and then kind of like it's a full body pulling movement, and you're having to move the bar, from the floor basically to overhead and then receive it. So you're creating a lot of movement at a lot of different joints, and you're creating high velocities. So you could say like, oh, that should be a great exercise for wrestling. But when kids go to wrestle, it's like, how do you know that's having an effect on their performance? How do you know it's having a meaningful change? Because it's different enough. It's in the weight room, it's not on the mat. And so for me, there's that sense of like somewhat of a black box of, we're going to do all this stuff in the weight room. We're going to try to train. We're going to try to become as good as we can at these like quote unquote proxy measures of performance. And if we can improve them, you should be a better athlete, or have the ability to express athleticism better. But I'm not quite sure. So you talked a bit about the isometric mid thigh pull. You talked a bit about jumps. What are your thoughts on kind of like my commentary on this idea of, we're kind of playing around with black boxes where we put best ideas and best guesses in, and we're
Yeah.
kind of hoping that it has a result that we want to have?
Yeah, I think you've put it really well there. I think you also strike a note by saying we're making you a better athlete, or at least your ability to express your athleticism on the
Mm,
mat, for example. You know, and I think the wording is really important. You can't turn around to a soccer player and say, doing these squats is going to make you a better football player. Like, that's
mm,
just not the case. It's just not the case, because it's so multidimensional. But the black box thought, this is something we're currently kind of thinking about and how to expand. Like the isometric mid thigh pull, even the pull from the set position, which Sean Joff has investigated, and we're going to be doing a little bit more on that in the coming months, actually. And jump performance. I've had an athlete turn around to me and say, "I'm rubbish at jumping." It's like, yeah, but I'm not trying to make you better at jumping.
mm.
I'm I don't care how high you jump. I'm interested in how you're expressing your force that's causing that output, right? And it's a fair comment by the athlete by saying, "Well, I also don't like jumping, but who cares, because I'm an international medalist." It's like, yeah, absolutely fair. That's a very fair point. Is a very, very fair point. So this is where I think, and this is where my PhD is trying to take the narrative. Is we're often our hands are a little bit tied when we try to publish information, because it has to be quite succinct on what you're delivering. So
Mm.
normally you get these papers that isolate specific measures, right? So mid thigh pulls, jumps, barbell trajectories, but really in the sport of weightlifting, that all needs to be looked at holistically, and that's purely from a physical and technical perspective. That doesn't even consider the psychology of the athlete on the day, right? So that adds another dimension to it. So what we're actually trying to do at the moment is we're very happy using these proxy measures to try and identify key limiting factors from a physical perspective, but also try to use, let's say, changes in barbell velocity at specific phases of the lift. So now we have, I suppose, a technique measure. And for those that are interested, please check out Ingo Sandow's work. That's been done with some of the German national team on barbell accelerations, like incredibly useful, incredibly applied. So using that information, then maybe using some of these reliable and valid proxy measures, like your pull from floor, pull from maybe even below knee for transition, or at knee, and the mid thigh. So you can get peak force. So, okay, we know how much force you're producing at each of those phases. We know how fast you're lifting at the end of each of those phases as load increases. Then we can try and map that back to the stuff they do in the gym, which would be how much are you block snatching, how much are you hang snatching. Then we intuitively think, okay, block snatch, purely concentric, hang snatch, you're using a counter movement, so it has some form of stretch shortening. Okay, we use the traditional ratios that have been presented by a number of individuals now, but again, I think it was the Soviets that presented it the first time, but I could be wrong. And we can have a look at, are those ratios out of sync? Does that map back to the, let's just call them lab-based tests, where we do the isometric pulls? Does it map back to how you're expressing force during ballistic movements like the jump? And does that then map back to identifying where your limiting factor within the lift is, either in the first pull transition or second pull? And that way you've now got a holistic overview of going, okay, this is what the data is telling us. But coach, what do you think? Lifter, what do you think? And let's see if that all marries up. If it marries up, you've got a nice plan moving ahead. If it doesn't marry up, you need to think about, well, why do you think it's the first pull that needs improving when our data is suggesting actually you're losing the most speed around the transition when the load increases, and also the force you produce at the knee is incredibly low relative to first pull and mid thigh. And also when we look at your hang snatch, it's really, really low in comparison to your full lift.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts? Because that's, I've spoken quite a bit about lift ratios, and I've had Max speak quite a bit about lift ratios. And I had Carl from Palm Beach Weightlifting reach out, and he sent a meme with some drug addict basically kind of like, hey, do you got those new lift ratios? I was like, yeah, I'll make sure I do a podcast with Max about it. Still haven't gotten around to that, but as far as you're concerned, what's your perspective on the lift ratios? What's your perspective on identifying limiting factors and how this can be applicable for all of the weightlifting coaches who are listening, who do think about that, and who, like myself, I've programmed in a way where I look at the PRs for block snatch above knee, hang snatch below knee, power snatch, snatch from the floor, overhead squat, snatch balance, a variety of exercises. And I've said, okay, this one's out of sync. And yeah, the technique, also when you watch someone lift for years and years, you're like, the technique just looks like the technique. I don't know if I see anything at all now. I just see what's glaringly wrong with it, but I don't as much see speeds. I don't see differences as much in speed or patterns of force production. And And then, okay, well, the block above the knee is a very, very, very low relative to what it should be. So we'll do, 4 to 8 weeks of training that, and we'll get it up to, say, 100 or 103% of the classic snatch. And then we turn that into more of the classic work, and they just don't have quite the effect that we want to have. So I think for me, that's a limit. That's an inability to either sequence training or to find the issue and improve the issue. With what you're looking at, studying, and attempting to understand, what's your perspective on this huge concept of lift ratios, its role in programming, and then how this is going to take it a step further, but like how to integrate that into a plan of on the competition day, ensuring optimal or like best performance.
Yeah. So, truth be told, I don't program using ratios. I never haven't. My skepticism comes with the fact that you get it, those ratios will change depending on your training phase, right? And what we really are interested in is what are your ratios when you've hit a PB, right? Because obviously something's right, and whatever those ratios are seems to be pretty decent, that you've added another 2 or 3 kilos to your snatch. So we'll take that. The problem is, and it's the problem with any 1RM type testing, you can't do all those 1RMs so close to a competition. So you might have collected that information 3 months ago, which is, let's say, 12 weeks. That's more than enough time for some adaptation to occur or some change to occur. But now, because you collected block snatch from above knee 12 weeks ago, but now you're so close to competition, you're only doing snatches and you're not going to max their block snatch out. How do you know that's changed, or how do you even monitor that? And that's the difficult thing to kind of get my head around and accept. But when you read the literature that's presented by the Soviets, a lot of their percentages tend to be 2 to 3 months. So within 2 to 3 months, when did they hit these lifts? That's a huge amount of time, in my opinion. So I think the purpose of the ratio is more so if we identify, using however which method you use, whether you use the change in velocity between each phase method, which is presented by Ingo in some of his papers, whether you use some force plate measure using jumps or mid-thigh pull or pull at knee or pull from floor, you then want to go, okay, I want to improve a specific physical quality. So I want to increase the amount of force you're producing from the floor. So therefore, I should see the peak force in your isometric pull from floor go up after this training block.
Right.
But at the same time, I should also see your snatch grip deadlift increase as a 1RM, which would therefore change your ratio. So there's so many different ways to look at it, and maybe I'm overcomplicating it, but it also comes back to what you said about how do you apply that all to competition day. Like, anything can happen on competition day. We all know that. And some of the issues can also be if you collect that data really close to comp and that data's tanked and now they're going into a competition knowing that their peak force from the floor has gone down, their snatch grip deadlift is not budged at all, they're going to go with a really bad mindset. So you need to be really cognizant of that. Someone could do really well in their competition, but nothing could have changed in any of those measures previous, so all those proxy measures. So there's no real cause and effect there. But to give you some indication, and I know you said you're going to link the ResearchGate, but I put up a case study back from 2019, and I noticed there was a cause and effect that as concentric impulse increased and as isometric mid-thigh pull increased, the weight we could put on the bar to attempt also increased.
Mm.
And that doesn't necessarily mean he made all the lifts, but we could put something on the bar which we think he could lift in a competition, which is another issue in itself with a majority of our weightlifting studies. You know, we're always comparing it against the lifts made, but never against the heaviest lift attempted. And at a weightlifting competition, you're not going to put a weight on the bar which you can't have a very good attempt at, right?
Right.
I mean, you see some absurd things like a 13 kilo increase in the clean and jerk, and someone makes it. Like, it is what it is. But you know, and that, you know, we imagine you had 50 athletes, and you're comparing, I don't know, one of their ratios. Let's say 80% is there. I don't know, not 80 is not a good ratio. Let's say like 95% of their max snatch has been done in the hang snatch, and say for all 50 of those athletes, but all of those athletes underperformed on the day because they only made their first lift. So does that mean there's not a good relationship now, or does that mean something else? Like, it's really hard to tell. I just think we work in a sport that's just can be overly complex, and there's lots of different ways of looking at it. But trying to simplify that for the athlete and actually to come up with good interventions that make sense requires not just objective information from multiple sources, but also the intuition of the coach.
No, I think that's a great explanation of it. And thinking about it now, that really makes sense of, here are these numbers. You assume they're stable without thinking about them like degrading over time. And you would say, okay, well, you know, we just hit a huge low hang snatch PR. Therefore, whatever qualities support that particular movement must be improved. And then say you test one arm snatch at some time point shortly after. Well, that's improved as well. Great, we're on the right track. You're looking at setting up the next training macro cycle, and you're thinking about where you should kind of focus your efforts. And you'd say, well, we haven't done block above knee. Maybe they look a little slow through that part of the pull. Okay, we'll emphasize that, and you improve it and improve it and improve it. 12 weeks later, there's no effect on classic snatch or classic clean and jerk 1RM. And you're thinking like, well, we improved the block above the knee. Does that mean there's no like really like what's happening? Was our ability to translate that into a 1RM kind of failed? And you don't think about potential neglect of, the low hang derivatives, or, movements with an eccentric then concentric component. Because you kind of lose that snapshot of it 12 weeks later when you haven't really pushed it, tried it, or involved it in the program. And maybe, if you did another training block with low hang derivatives and that went really, really well, and they did another classic snatch PR, you could say like, oh, well, maybe this is more tightly related, their performance on this. Maybe the block above the knee naturally just sits a bit lower and doesn't need to be much, much higher. It doesn't need to be in excess. Because what it feels like, and from my perspective, this is a bit of a short-sighted view of it, but you think, or I would think, oh, if we get a lot of excess with, say, block snatch and hang snatch and snatch balance and overhead squat, that means it's just going to pull the classic snatch up as high as every lift is. So if we get to 105% for all of the variations, that means we should hit a huge classic snatch PR.
Theoretically, yeah.
And it doesn't work that way, at least from my perspective. I haven't seen it work that way. And I think a lot of that is because it loses, it loses the big picture for some of the details.
Of
And
course.
yeah, so now I think about it, and it's like, well, how can we use those derivatives as more supportive movements that can be a focus on, hey, pushing their 1RMs higher, but also can be supported from more of just like a skill standpoint of, hey,
Yeah.
we have a really big snatch session on day one, and we're doing the classic snatch, so we have a certain number of reps or a certain number of sets. And then on day two, we want to snatch a little more frequently. So we'll use,
Hmm.
say, a no feet hang snatch below knee. And we'll say that's a great derivative for improving these qualities of the technique. We're also revisiting that variation. Maybe we even have a block snatch above the knee at the end of the week. So we have a thread of everything within the training week. And we can bank on, at least we're not, at least there's not this decay of whatever we were working on or focusing on. So we're keeping a thread of, some lifts in there, but making the focus the classic lift. And then you can look at, okay, how's their skill development been over the training block? How have they been moving? How have the strength movements been progressing? And actually, every time I talk to Max, he mentions, the lifts with a high correlation to snatch and clean and jerk performance, which would be the power snatch and block snatch and hang snatch.
Hmm.
And for him, those exercises frequently, very frequently, live in a weightlifting program. You're never going to completely exile one of them or two of them or three of them. And it doesn't mean you do them all the time, but it's just the way you program. You think about the phases of the lift that need to be improved, variations that are
Right.
suitable to that phase, and then you can put them in at different time points instead of saying, like, we have a basic microcycle that would repeat, and we just do the same lifts over and over. You would say we have 4 weeks. This part of the lift could use some work. So on day one, we'll do block snatch above knee. Um, week two, day one, we'll do hang snatch above knee, no feet. Day three, we'll do no feet block snatch above knee. So we're doing a hang snatch, we're doing a block snatch. We might even have a power derivative at some point in there. So we're kind of using exercises that target specific phases of the technique instead of saying, like, the exercise is the thing. It's like,
Yeah.
what are the qualities we want to develop, making that the thing. And that was like a mindset shift for me. I haven't completely overhauled or retooled the way I program, but this conversation has definitely been huge and at least expanding me to the idea of the decay of different lifts, the necessity of knowing the ratio that supports improved weightlifting performance, not the perceived ratio that should improve weightlifting performance, and how those things can be a little disconnected. And when you talk about assessment protocols or monitoring protocols, I wish that was more widely accessible so people could test, you know, how much force they produce and the rate of that force production off the floor, at the knee, at the power position, so they could have a better glimpse into what those look like. And then if you improve them over time, how that impacts performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just thinking about the ratio and decay, if you think about training, sometimes it doesn't always transfer into the full lift, but that's kind of like the training block of realization,
Mm,
right? You want to ensure that what you've trained, that specific area, is actually being drip fed into the full lift, and there is a real focal point of lifting around that knee in as the example you gave, and making sure that transfers into the full snatch. And I suppose that's also the beauty of the sport, is it's not just the physical qualities,
mm.
but also the execution of the lift and the intricacies around the technique as well. And I think that's always something that's fun to try and explore, for sure. I think the other way of trying to look at it as well, just from a coaching perspective, is actually looking at the volume that has been dedicated
Mhm.
in that training block to the snatch, or to block work, or to pull work, for example, because then you've got an idea of how much is enough to elicit a
Mhm.
change in that phase of training and in that phase of the lift.
Well, and I think sometimes it feels like the approach that's generally taken based on the where we're at in a program is this kind of shotgun approach of we want to improve this quality or this lift, or this like set of derivatives. So let's put all of our big days will be focused on that.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have a really big like high stimulus day that'll be focused on block snatch. Then we'll have a few smaller days, and that'll be focused on the block snatch too. And I do this because, to me, if I'm thinking of, if I really want to overhaul a certain movement, say block snatch above the knee, I like to really consolidate training to reflect that. And not just from a singular standpoint of, well, we're going to do a lot of block snatch above the knee, but from the standpoint of, here's a day where we do block snatch above the knee for more work. We're building like specific work capacity, and then we're doing another day that might be for higher intensity, so we're focused more on intensifying the training. We have a day that is a hang snatch above the knee that's slightly related, but a different movement to work on slightly different aspects of the technique and slightly different qualities with the stretch shortening cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would say, okay, and then we might have a pause at the knee. So we're still hitting that same position. We're still allocating a lot of resources to everything that happens from the knee and above, but they just have this slightly different flavor. And I think that variability is great for just improving the skill overall, and then also having a slightly different effect on the athlete. Do you have any perspective on that? Because that's definitely an approach I've taken in the past.
Yeah, I like it. It just fits the model of I'm not going to say periodization, but programming, right? Because you have a skill, let's say almost a skill day, where the intensities are lower. So it's it's an easy day essentially. You have a day where it's going to be slightly heavier in weight, so you have a hard day, and you might have a moderate day. It's just the exercises that you're putting in will then indicate the difficulty that the athlete will be experiencing, or the intensity the athlete will be experiencing.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah, that
I've
makes sense.
definitely done that, and I've done that. It's more obvious in say like a powerlifter's training, because my general kind of recipe. I don't know if we all have recipes, but like I have certain styles of doing things that make sense and work well. And for a powerlifting program, I actually just wrote one recently for someone coming off USA Powerlifting Nationals, Danny Myers Glenn, and she did really well. And we're going to turn her around, and we got a really short prep for the state Ohio State Championships here in like 7 weeks. And say we have 3 bench days, three days for developing the bench press. We'll have a classic day, which is generally going to be, initially the most classically periodized. It's going to be the highest volumes. And then that's going to go from maybe, say, 5 sets of 7 over time to maybe 8 sets of 4, and then to maybe like, this is all with top sets. So maybe we do, 5 sets of 7, but it's a top set of 7 plus down sets. And then it'll be 8 sets of 4. It'll be a top set of 4 and down sets. And then kind of towards the end, we might run a block or two with doubles and singles, and then a bunch of down work. Focusing on increasing the average weight on the bar, focusing on making, everything just slightly more specific. So it might be touch and go to first rep pause to all pause or something.
Yeah.
And then the other days will be, so day 2 will be the second most important day, and that will be one variation. So it might be, a close grip bench press, and that'll be close grip throughout the program. That third day will be a less important day, but more technical. So it'll be a close grip, and maybe you have your feet up on the bench or your feet off the bench, or you're doing some sort of other variation. So you have classic, you have 1 constraint and then 2 constraints. And I like to kind of modify that based on the technical needs of the person, based on kind of how long the training block is. And then I like to progress those over time, maybe removing constraints or just changing them slightly. I kind of like that for weightlifting too. I think that for me, that, as you mentioned, ticks a lot of boxes of managing training load, focusing on skill development, and then I think, if we start to talk about how the athletes think about their training, it definitely increases enjoyment because you have a good amount of variety, and that keeps it fun and it kind of enriches what they're doing.
Yeah, especially in weightlifting where you're doing the same thing day in, day out for maybe 1 or 2 kilos every 12 to 16 weeks, especially at the top
Right.
end, So I think that is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think this was a great chat. I kind of took over at the end, but it's more so I was really I was really stimulated from all of the information you kind of provided up front and all the ideas. For people who are interested in learning a lot more, I know you have so many resources on the internet, and the group you work with, you guys provide so many resources. So where can people go to find all the stuff you do? The stuff Angela and Stu and Anthony, all the stuff they do as well.
Yeah, so ResearchGate, you can just search me up on ResearchGate. It's a really good resource for those maybe that don't have access to peer-reviewed literature, which is often through academic institutions. ResearchGate is a place where a lot of researchers will put their work, and it's free, so that's always good. So you could just search my name and put ResearchGate in, and that'll pop up. Alternatively, I am happy to answer or provide resources via email. My email is s.chavda, CHAVDA, at mdx.ac.uk. I'm also available on Twitter, shy underscore the number 2 and then tweet. And I'm also a little bit less, but I'm also on Instagram as well, which is coach underscore chavda. So any method of reaching out to me, and I'll get back, and always happy to talk shop and provide resources.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll link as much as I can of that down below. If people are interested in keeping up with me and what I have going on, you can find me on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. That's PHILWL. You can use that code PhilWL at Weightlifting House, Onyx Straps, Earthfed Muscle, host of places to save some money and support the show. That all of that will be in the description, my website, anything of note that if you find that you're salivating at the mouth thinking about weightlifting and programming, you can go in the description box and satisfy that urge. Just don't tell your friends and family about it, because that's very odd. Thanks again for tuning into another episode of the podcast, guys, and we will catch you all next week.